The sun rose over South Texas like a punishment. By 7 in the morning, the temperature on Farm to Market Road 462 had already climbed past 90 degrees, and the asphalt shimmered in long, wavering ribbons of heat that made the horizon look like it was breathing. There were no trees along this stretch of road, no shade, no mercy, just flat scrubland running in every direction, broken only by the occasional rusted fence post and the bleached skull of something that hadn't survived the last drought. It was a landscape with no opinion on survival, indifferent to arrival, indifferent to departure, indifferent to the living and the dead, with the same vast sun-scorched impartiality. Rourke Calhoun had ridden through worse. He had ridden through the frozen pre-dawn darkness of a Montana January, his fingers so numb inside his gloves he couldn't feel the throttle. He had ridden through a flash flood in New Mexico, water sheeting across the highway in solid walls, his front tire hunting for traction on submerged asphalt. He had ridden through grief and fury and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has buried someone he loved and found no place left to put the weight of it. Rourke Calhoun had been riding since he was 19 years old, and in the 15 years since he had earned his patch, he had learned that the road gave you exactly what you brought to it. Nothing more, nothing less. This morning he had brought his guard down. That was the mistake. That was the only mistake that mattered in the end. He was 34 years old and he wore his patch the way other men wore their skin. Not as a costume, not as a performance, but as the fundamental truth of who he was. The death's head on the back of his leather cut was faded from years of sun and rain and the relentless friction of highway miles, but it was still the most honest thing about him. He had earned it the hard way, the only way the club accepted, and he carried the weight of it with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who has made his peace with the life he chose. He was riding back from a parts run, a simple errand, a favor for the chapter's lead mechanic Denton, who needed a specific carburetor assembly that could only be sourced from a dealer in Laredo. 200 miles south, 200 miles back. A morning's ride on empty roads with nothing between him and the horizon, but heat and asphalt and the low, steady thunder of the engine beneath him. Nothing about it should have been dangerous. Nothing about it should have been anything other than what it appeared to be. He was 10 miles north of the Laredo city limits when the pickup truck appeared. It came out of a dirt access road on the right shoulder, a heavy-duty Ford, the kind ranchers used to haul equipment, except this one had been lifted 4 inches and fitted with a brush guard that looked like it had already introduced itself to several other vehicles. It pulled onto the highway without slowing, cutting directly across Rourke's lane, and for one suspended second, Rourke thought it was just a careless driver. Someone who hadn't checked their mirrors. Someone he could swerve around and curse at and leave behind in a rooster tail of exhaust. Then the rear window of the truck slid down. Rourke had enough time to register the shape of the barrel before the shot came. The sound of it was enormous in the flat open air, a concussive crack that rolled out across the scrubland and came back as a hollow echo from nothing. The round caught him along the right side just below his lowest rib, a grazing impact that felt in the first millisecond less like being shot and more like being struck by something very hot and very fast-moving. His body registered the physics of it before his mind did. The bike lurched, his right hand spasmed on the throttle. The front wheel caught the gravel shoulder, and the whole machine went sideways in a single violent movement. And then Rourke Calhoun was no longer riding his motorcycle. He was tumbling across the hard-packed dirt shoulder with 260 pounds of custom Harley-Davidson panhead coming apart around him. He came to rest in the shallow drainage ditch along the highway's edge. For several seconds, he didn't move. He lay face down in the dirt with the ringing in his ears so loud it blotted out everything else, and he performed the inventory that every man learns to perform in the aftermath of sudden violence. Fingers, toes, the ability to draw breath. His fingers worked. His toes responded. His lungs expanded painfully, dragging in a lungful of dust, and the sharp chemical smell of leaking fuel from the wreckage of his bike scattered across the shoulder behind him. He rolled onto his back and looked up at the white Texas sky and felt the heat of the wound before he felt the pain of it. The pain arrived a moment later. It arrived with the authority of something that had been waiting patiently for his adrenaline to step aside. And when it came, it was not the sharp, bright pain of impact, but something deeper and more serious. A grinding, twisting agony centered in his right flank that told him the round had done more than graze the surface. He pressed his right hand against the wound and felt the wet heat of blood soaking immediately through his fingers. He looked at his hand, dark red. Too much of it, moving too fast. He heard the truck slow somewhere on the road above him. Then he heard other engines. Not one, several. The deep synchronized rumble of motorcycles idling up from the south, and his blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss. They hadn't been riding with the truck. They had been behind him on the highway, hanging back far enough to stay out of his mirrors, waiting for the truck to do the first part of the work. This had been coordinated. This had been planned with the kind of precision that required foreknowledge. Someone who had known his route, his timing, the fact that he would be alone on this road at this hour of the morning. Clayton Maddox. The name arrived in Rourke's mind with the flat certainty of a fact he had known for some time, but had not fully reckoned with. Bull Maddox, the Bandito's primary enforcer south of San Antonio, who had spent the better part of 2 years pushing the borders of his territory northward, with the patient, methodical aggression of a man who understood that most battles are won before the first shot is fired. The club had been watching him. The club had been managing the situation with the careful diplomacy of people who understood that open war was expensive in ways that went beyond bodies. And Rourke, riding south alone on a Tuesday morning with a carburetor in his saddlebag, had apparently been the opportunity Maddox had decided to use. He got out of the ditch. It cost him more than he wanted to admit. He got his hands under him and pushed, and his arms shook with the effort, and the wound in his side screamed with a specificity that suggested at least one of his lower ribs had absorbed some of the round's energy. But he got upright. He got his legs under him. He looked at the highway and saw the truck parked on the shoulder 200 yards back, and he saw the cluster of motorcycles stop behind it. And he saw the figures of men standing in the road watching him with the patient stillness of people who are certain about the outcome. And he turned away from all of it and began to walk north. Walking was the wrong word for what he was doing. He was moving his body north through an act of sustained, deliberate will, one foot in front of the other, pressing his left hand hard against the wound in his side, and feeling the blood soak through the bandana he had pulled from his back pocket and folded into a rough compress. His right leg dragged slightly. Something in his hip had been wrenched by the fall and had registered its objection and was now simply going to continue registering it regardless of what he decided. His boots scraped across the gravel shoulder with each step, and behind him he could hear the engines of the motorcycles revving, and he knew with complete clarity that he was not going to outrun them. He was not going to outfight them. He was not going to do anything clever or strategic or heroic. He was going to keep walking until he couldn't walk anymore, and then he was going to find out what came next. The heat was extraordinary. It pressed down from above and radiated up from the asphalt in equal measure, wrapping around him like something with weight and intention. And the light was so flat and white and merciless that the scrubland around him seemed to have no depth, no dimension, just a featureless, pale expanse, offering nothing in any direction. He pressed the bandana harder against his side and felt the blood move through it and kept walking. And then, through the heat shimmer rising off the road ahead, something materialized. It appeared gradually the way distant things appear on flat ground, first as a thickening in the air, then as shapes, then as structure with edges and meaning. A low adobe building set back from the road behind a wrought iron fence. A wooden cross mounted above a door sun-bleached to the color of bone. A sign that he couldn't read at this distance, but that he could make out letter by letter as he closed the gap one agonizing step at a time. St. Jude Parish, Sanctuary of Hope. St. Jude, Rourke thought, the patron saint of lost causes. He laughed. The sound came out wrong, thick and wet at the edges, and he felt something that wasn't air move through his chest when he did it, and he stopped laughing and focused on the gate. The iron gate was old and heavy, and it was closed but not locked, and when he reached it and pushed it open, the hinges complained in a long, grinding protest that seemed very loud in the still morning air. He made it through the gate. He made it 10 feet across the courtyard's terracotta tiles before his legs decided they had fulfilled their obligations for the morning. He went down slowly, which was the only mercy available to him at the moment. His knees touched the tile first, and then his hands, and then he was on his side, with his cheek against the warm stone, and the sky above him was the same white and merciless thing it had been over the highway, except that there was a shadow crossing it now. A small, upright figure moving toward him with neither haste nor hesitation, as though a bleeding man on the courtyard tiles was something she had been expecting to deal with before lunch. He heard the sound of orthopedic shoes on terracotta. He heard a voice say with an absence of alarm that was itself alarming, "Don't move, I'm coming to you." The woman who knelt beside him was small. She stood perhaps 5 feet and 2 inches in her shoes, and she wore the traditional black habit and white veil of a religious order. And her face beneath the veil was the face of a woman who had been 70 years old, long enough to have made a certain peace with it. Her hair, what he could see of it, was gray. Her eyes were the color of winter lake water, pale and very still and missing nothing. And they moved over him with a speed and precision that had nothing to do with pastoral concern and everything to do with clinical assessment. She was not looking at a man. She was looking at a wound with a man attached to it, and she was already calculating what needed to happen next. Her name was Sister Eleanor Byrne, though Rourke did not know this yet. She pulled aside his leather cut without asking permission, her fingers finding the soaked bandana and lifting it with the economy of motion that belongs to someone who has done this before, who has done this many times in conditions not unlike these. She pressed her thumbs into the wound, and Rourke's vision went white at the edges, and he made a sound that he would not have made if he had been able to prevent it. "The bullet grazed the rib," she said. Her voice was steady in the manner of someone who has stood at enough bedsides to have made a complete peace with crisis. "It's a deep furrow. You're losing blood, but the artery's intact. I can manage this." "You need to go inside," Rourke said. His voice sounded distant to him, as though someone else were using it from the other side of a wall. "They're behind me. There are men behind me on that road." "I know," Eleanor said. "They will hurt you." "Perhaps," she said. "Hold this." She took his hand and pressed it firmly over the bandana and curled his fingers into position until she was satisfied with the pressure. Then she stood up and she looked toward the gate, and her expression did not change by a single degree. He heard the engine stop. The silence that replaced them was different from the silence of the empty highway. This silence had people in it. He heard the heavy sound of a kickstand being dropped, and then another, and then the sound of boots on asphalt, unhurried, deliberate. The sound of men who are entirely certain about what is going to happen and see no reason to rush it. The gate opened. Clayton Maddox was a large man. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches and carried nearly 300 pounds on a frame that had been built for violence and had been maintained by it across 4 decades of living at the hard edge of everything. His beard was thick and threaded with gray. His leather cut was heavy with patches and pins and the accumulated insignia of a long career in organized brutality. He carried a steel crowbar in his right hand, not brandished, simply carried, the way a tool belongs in the hand of a man who knows exactly what he intends to use it for. Behind him came 5 men fanning out as they entered the courtyard, with the practiced ease of people who had done variations of this before. Maddox stopped. The elderly nun was standing in the center of the courtyard, between him and the bleeding man on the tiles, holding a pair of pruning shears at her side. She was not praying. She was not trembling. She was watching him with the calm, assessing attention of a woman who has already decided how this conversation is going to go and is simply waiting for him to catch up. "Sister," Maddox said, and the word came out weighted with the particular contempt of a man who has never encountered an obstacle he couldn't move and has stopped expecting to. "Step aside. We've got business with the man behind you. This doesn't have to involve you." "This is the sanctuary of St. Jude," Eleanor said. Her voice carried across the courtyard without effort, level and precise as a chalk line. "You are trespassing on consecrated ground. I suggest you leave." Maddox's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. The men behind him made sounds that weren't quite laughter. One of them, a younger man with restless hands, shifted his weight and let his fingers drift toward the gun visible at his waistband. "We'll be out of your hair in 5 minutes, sister," Maddox said, stepping forward. "Just need to finish something that got started down the road." Eleanor did not step back. "Let me describe what happens if you proceed," she said. Her tone did not rise. It did not sharpen. It narrowed the way a surgeon's focus narrows when the incision begins becoming more specific and more absolute. You kill a Hell's Angel in a roadside ditch, the county sheriff writes a report and files it in a drawer. But you beat a man to death on the grounds of a Catholic church in front of a member of a religious order on a Tuesday morning. That is no longer a biker dispute. That is a federal hate crime. That is a civil rights violation. That is the desecration of a protected religious institution. The ATF, the FBI, and the Texas Rangers do not file those things in drawers, Mr. Maddox. Maddox had stopped walking. "You don't know who I am," he said. "Clayton Ray Maddox," Eleanor said. "Born March of 1959 in Odessa. I know who you are." The courtyard went very quiet. Behind Maddox, two of his men exchanged a glance. The one with the restless hands had gone still. "You have outstanding federal warrants," Eleanor continued. "3 of your men behind you have active parole violations. If a state police cruiser turns onto this road in the next several minutes, which is a possibility I would not dismiss, none of you go home today. And I promise you, Mr. Maddox, that I will make certain the first warrant issued carries your given name." Maddox stared at her. He was a man accustomed to reading people, accustomed to finding the hairline fracture in whatever composure someone was presenting, the tremor in the jaw, the too rapid blink, the barely perceptible drawing of breath that gives away the fear underneath. He searched Eleanor Burns' face with the practiced attention of a predator and found nothing of the kind. What he found instead was something he had encountered very rarely in his life, a person who was not performing the absence of fear, but who genuinely, constitutionally did not register his presence as a threat worth being afraid of. It was more unsettling than anything she could have said. "You're bluffing," he said. The certainty had thinned in his voice. "I pressed my medical alert device when I saw your man in the ditch," Eleanor said, touching a small black device clipped to her gardening apron. "The dispatcher has this address. Whether I am bluffing is something you will determine in approximately 4 minutes." She held his gaze without flinching. "I would use that time wisely." One of Maddox's men stepped close and said something low that Rourke, bleeding on the tiles, couldn't hear. Maddox's jaw tightened. He looked past Eleanor at Rourke, who was watching all of this with the focused, conserving attention of a man who has decided to spend his remaining energy on observation rather than action. "You're going to regret getting in the middle of this," Maddox said. "I have lived 70 years in the middle of things," Eleanor replied, without heat, without drama, without any quality that suggested she found the statement remarkable. "I have managed." Maddox stood there for another long moment. The crowbar hung at his side. His men waited. The sun continued its indifferent work on all of them. And then, with a movement that was almost imperceptible, something went out of Clayton Maddox's posture. Not dramatically, not all at once, but something in the set of his shoulders changed the way a door changes when the latch releases. And the calculation behind his eyes arrived at a conclusion that was not the one he had planned for when he turned off the highway 20 minutes ago. He looked at Rourke one last time. "You're a lucky man, Calhoun," he said. His voice was stripped of performance, now flat and factual. "Luck runs out." He turned, he walked back through the gate. His men followed, and the gate swung shut behind them, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. And then there was nothing but the engine starting, and the engines receding down FM 462, and the particular quality of silence a place holds after violence has visited and departed without completing itself. Eleanor stood without moving until the last engine sound had dissolved entirely into the distance. Then she let out a breath slow and controlled, the breath of a person who has been holding a great many things in position and can finally carefully set them down. She turned around. Rourke was watching her from the tiles. She walked back to him and knelt and resumed her assessment of the wound with the same focused attention she had brought to it before the interruption, and when she pressed the compress back into place, he made no sound this time, only set his jaw and held his ground. "Who are you?" he said. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She examined the wound, reading what the blood told her about rate and depth and what was damaged beneath the surface, and how much time remained before the situation became irreversible. "I'm going to need Father Declan to help me get you inside," she said. "Can you put any weight on your right leg?" "Some," Rourke said. "Then we'll manage together." She looked up at him then, and those pale eyes were direct and certain, and carried in them something he could not immediately name, something that was not pity and was not simply the obligation of the vocation, but something older and more personal than either of those things. "My name is Sister Eleanor Byrne. I was a trauma nurse at Cook County Hospital in Chicago for 12 years before I entered religious life." "You found the right gate, Mr. Calhoun." "How do you know my name?" he said. She reached into the inner pocket of his leather cut and produced his wallet and opened it and showed him his license and returned it with the same efficient sequence of motions. "Because I looked," she said. "Now be still. Father Declan is 80 years old and his knees are considerably worse than yours. We're going to have to be efficient." Father Declan emerged from the heavy oak doors of the rectory at Eleanor's call. He was a small elderly man with white hair and an expression of profound, unshakable faith that appeared entirely undisturbed by the sight of a bleeding biker on his courtyard tiles. He asked no questions. He positioned himself on Rourke's left side, while Eleanor took the right, and between the two of them, a 70-year-old nun and an 80-year-old priest. They got Rourke Calhoun off the terracotta and through the oak doors and down the short corridor to the room at the back of the parish that served simultaneously as pantry and free clinic. The room was not large. Metal shelving ran along 3 walls, holding canned goods and dry staples on one side and medical supplies on the other. IV bags and suturing kits and broad-spectrum antibiotics and wound dressings arranged with the orderly intention of someone who had stocked this inventory according to knowledge rather than guesswork. A stainless steel prep table occupied the center of the room, and it was onto this that they maneuvered Rourke with a carefully coordinated effort that left all 3 of them breathing harder than before. Eleanor moved to the deep industrial sink and washed her hands the way Cook County had taught her elbows to fingertips, nothing left to chance, and snapped on latex gloves. She cut Rourke's shirt away from the wound with a pair of trauma shears. Father Declan, without being asked, retrieved the heavy olive-drab medical bag from the lower shelf and set it beside the table and withdrew to his position in the doorway, where he folded his hands and arranged his expression into its habitual attitude of composed readiness. Rourke stared at the ceiling. The pain was something he was managing rather than experiencing, now holding it at arm's length through the application of a discipline he had developed over years and had never been more grateful for. He felt Eleanor's hands on his side exact and without hesitation, and he turned his head and watched her work with the focused attention of someone who has stopped being surprised by things and has simply started paying attention to them. He thought about what he had just witnessed in the courtyard. The small woman in the black habit standing between him and Clayton Maddox, standing there without a weapon and without backup, and without as far as he could determine a single moment of genuine doubt. He had seen courage in his life. He had been in the presence of men for whom fearlessness was simply the absence of something that had been burned out of them long ago. He had seen bravery that was calculation, and bravery that was performance, and bravery that was the pure instinctive response of a body that has decided fighting is more likely to produce survival than running. He had not before this morning seen a 70-year-old woman in a religious veil stand in front of a man with a crowbar and 6 armed men behind him and speak to him in a voice that carried the absolute unconditional quality of someone who has made their arrangements and is at peace with all outcomes. "You should have gone inside," he said. Eleanor administered a local anesthetic around the wound margins. Her hands did not waver by a fraction. "Yes," she said, "I should have." She prepared the suture material with the deliberateness of someone for whom the work is serious, and the seriousness is itself a form of respect paid to the person on the table. I didn't, she said. Rourke processed that. He watched her thread the curved needle with fingers that did not tremble, and he thought about the look on Maddox's face when she had spoken his full name. Not surprise exactly. Something that had moved through Maddox's expression too quickly to be named something that had passed and been replaced almost immediately by the harder calculating thing that usually lived there. You know who he is, Rourke said. It came out as a statement rather than a question because it had arrived in his mind as one with the quiet certainty of a thing that explained several other things. Eleanor paused. The smallest interruption in the steady flow of her preparation, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. Then she resumed. I know what he is, she said. Rourke studied her face. She was not looking at him. She was focused on the wound and the work and the specific technical demands of this particular moment, and her expression gave him nothing beyond the clean professional attention of someone doing a difficult job with full commitment. But the pause had been there. He filed it. He was a man who had spent 15 years reading situations for the things that were not being said and what was not being said in this small room between the canned goods and the IV bags and the smell of iodine and the sound of the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead was something with weight to it. Something that was older than this morning. Something that had been present in this room perhaps long before he had arrived in it. This is going to hurt, Eleanor said. I know, Rourke said. Bite on this, Father Declan said, appearing at the table with a folded leather belt. Rourke took the belt. He looked at the ceiling. He felt Eleanor's hands begin their work, and he held the belt between his teeth and held the ground beneath him with everything he had. And outside through the thick adobe walls, the Texas morning continued its business without any acknowledgement of what was happening in this room. The sun moving across the scrubland and the empty highway and the gate through which he had stumbled, and the blood drying slowly on the terracotta tiles in the courtyard beyond. On the road outside, the sound of engines had been gone for some time. But before Maddox had mounted his bike and led his men back south on FM 462, he had done something that Rourke had not been positioned to see from the tiles of the courtyard. He had stood at the gate for a moment after his men had moved to their machines. He had stood there with his hand on the wrought iron and looked in at the courtyard, at the blood on the tiles, at the heavy oak doors, at the cross mounted above the entrance, bleached to the color of old bone by years of South Texas sun. And the expression on his face in that moment had not been the calculating expression of a man adjusting his tactical approach. It had been something older, something that arrived from a place the calculations didn't reach, something that looked in the quality of the light in the stillness of the moment, almost like a man recognizing a place he has been trying not to think about for a very long time. Then he had put on his sunglasses and walked to his bike, and the moment had closed behind him, and the dust had settled, and the courtyard of St. Jude Parish had been quiet again. Eleanor had not gone inside when she should have. She never did. The fever came on the second night without ceremony, the way fevers always come quietly and then completely. It slid in beneath the surface of Rourke's restless sleep and established itself with the patient authority of something that has chosen its ground and intends to hold it. Eleanor had anticipated it. She had seen the early signs in the afternoon of the first day, the slight flush along his cheekbones, the way his breathing had shifted from the shallow, controlled rhythm of a man managing pain to something more ragged and uneven. The way his eyes, when he was awake, had begun carrying that particular unfocused quality that signals the body has redirected its resources inward to fight a battle the mind is not invited to observe. She had started the antibiotics immediately after closing the wound. Broad spectrum, the strongest she had in the clinic's inventory, administered through an IV line she had placed in his left forearm with the practiced sureness of someone who had done it 10,000 times under worse conditions than these. She had changed the dressing twice in the first 12 hours, examining the wound margins each time with the exacting attention of someone who understood that infection in a field environment makes no allowances for good intentions. It comes quietly, and then it comes fast, and by the time most people recognize it, it has already made its decisions. Eleanor Byrne did not intend to let it make any decisions about this particular patient. She slept in the chair beside the steel table for the first 2 nights. not deeply. She had never been a deep sleeper, even before she took her vows when the night shifts at Cook County had trained her body to remain available to consciousness, even during the intervals between emergencies. She slept the way a person sleeps when they have assigned themselves the responsibility of another person's survival, resting her eyes while keeping her ears open, rising without complaint every 2 hours to check the IV line and the wound and the temperature and the quality of his breathing. Father Declan brought her coffee at 5 in the morning, both mornings without being asked. He asked no questions about the man on the table. Father Declan had been at St. Jude's for 22 years, and in those years the parish had become an informal refuge for farm workers without documentation for women in dangerous situations, for teenagers with nowhere specific to be on a given night. He had long since stopped requiring that the people Eleanor helped conform to any particular category of deserving. She helped people. That was the category. He brought the coffee and went back to his prayers and left her to her work. On the afternoon of the second day, the fever peaked. Rourke's temperature reached 103, and he moved in and out of a delirium that was, from Eleanor's clinical perspective, manageable but required attention. He spoke during the worst hours of it, not coherently, not in the sustained way of a man constructing a narrative, but in the compressed fragments of a mind sorting through its stored material without the filtering mechanism of consciousness to organize the output. He said names she didn't recognize. He said the word brother several times, each time with a weight that made clear it meant something specific and something that had cost him. He said once with a sudden clean clarity that cut through the surrounding incoherence, "I should have been there." Eleanor did not respond to the things he said during the fever. She had spent enough years sitting with people in crisis to understand that the words spoken in those hours are not addressed to the room. They go to an audience the patient carries internally, and the best a nurse can do is be present without intruding, which requires a particular quality of disciplined quiet that she had spent many years developing. She changed the dressing. She adjusted the IV rate. She placed a cool, damp cloth across his forehead and replaced it each time it warmed, and she sat with her rosary and moved through its decades with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a woman who has been having the same conversation with God for 40 years and maintains no expectation that it will arrive at any particular destination. The fever broke in the early hours of the third morning. She knew before she checked the thermometer because his breathing changed. It shifted from that strained, laboring quality of a body fighting something to something slower and deeper, and more organic, the breathing of a man who is genuinely asleep rather than simply unconscious. Eleanor leaned forward in the chair and looked at his face in the thin gray light coming through the high window and saw that the flush had receded and the tension in his jaw had released, and he was resting in a way he had not rested since he'd come through the gate. She let him sleep for 4 more hours. When he woke, he was present in a way he had not been for 2 days. His eyes found the ceiling, then the shelving, then her face, and they held their focus, and the focus was clear and deliberate. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough and dry, used-up sounding. "Afternoon," Eleanor said. She poured water from the pitcher on the side table and held it out to him. "Drink slowly." He drank. He surveyed the room with the quiet, systematic attention of a man reorienting himself, cataloging what he knew and what remained unclear, and where the gaps between those two things were. He looked at the IV line taped to his left forearm. He looked at the fresh dressing on his side, visible through the open front of the clean shirt Eleanor had found in the parish donation bin and changed him into during the second night. "How long?" he said. 2.5 days, Eleanor said. He absorbed this. "The fever." "Yes." "Is it finished?" "For now," Eleanor said. "The infection is responding. You'll complete the full antibiotic course regardless of how you feel about it. 10 days. Rourke looked at her steadily. "I need to reach my chapter." "I know," Eleanor said. "Not yet." He held her gaze. He was a man accustomed to having his statements received as conclusions rather than opening positions, and the absolute unargued quality of Eleanor's refusals was something he was still calibrating himself to. She did not debate with him. She did not explain herself at length. She simply stated the thing that was true from where she stood and waited for him to come around to it. "They'll think I'm dead," he said. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "that may not be entirely disadvantageous at the moment." He considered that. He had been doing the kind of thinking that circumstances demanded during the intervals of clarity the fever had allowed him, going back over the morning of the ambush with the methodical patience of a man reviewing a document for errors. The access road where the truck had been waiting. The timing of it precise enough to require foreknowledge of his specific route. The positioning of Maddox's bikes south of his location, which meant they had been ahead of him on the highway, which meant they had not followed him from San Antonio, but had been waiting for him at a predetermined point. Someone had known where he would be and when. He had not shared this thought with Eleanor. He had not shared much of anything with Eleanor in the hours since the fever broke, partly because conserving energy felt necessary, and partly because he was still assembling the full shape of what he knew, and he did not speak about things until he understood what he was saying. But there was something else he had been turning over during those same hours of fragile clarity, something that had nothing to do with the ambush and everything to do with the woman sitting in the chair beside him. On the first night before the fever had fully committed itself, Eleanor had sat with him through the early hours, and they had talked in the unself-conscious way people talk in the dark, when the ordinary structure of conversation has been stripped away by circumstances. She had told him about the clinic, about the farm workers who appeared at St. Jude's gate because they had nowhere else to go when things went wrong, about Cook County Hospital in the 80s, about the specific texture of a night shift in an emergency department serving the south side of Chicago during a decade when the south side of Chicago was making its most serious attempts at self-destruction. She spoke about these things in the precise, unsentimental way of someone reporting observations, not soliciting sympathy. And then she had told him about Patrick. She had told it the way she told everything, without preamble, without softening, as a sequence of facts that carried their own weight and required no arrangement into anything more comfortable. Her brother, younger than her by 9 years, a motorcycle club on the South Side, not an outlaw organization in the formal sense, but close enough to that edge that the distinction had mattered less and less as the years went on. Patrick had been a gentleman inside the leather, she said. That was the thing people never understood, the thing she had spent years attempting to explain to people who had already decided what they knew about men who wore certain things on their backs. He was gentle. He was loyal. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of people he met once and asked about them years later as though the asking were entirely natural. He had been 33 years old when they cornered him in an alley off South Halsted Street on a November night in 1983. He had been bleeding, Eleanor said. The way you're bleeding, maybe not as severe, but bleeding and alone, and the alley was not invisible from the street. People walked past. She said this without accusation, without the bitterness that statement might have carried from someone still in the process of digesting it. She said it as a fact about the world that she had had 40 years to sit with and had sat with thoroughly. People walked past. They heard him. They saw the jacket and the patches, and they performed the calculation that the sight of certain things causes certain people to perform the calculation that determines whether the life in front of you is a life that requires your involvement, and they decided it did not, and they walked on. Patrick Byrne had died alone on the floor of that alley in November of 1983. Rourke had listened without speaking. He had lain on the steel table in the dark and received Eleanor's account of these facts in their steady, uninflected delivery, and he had felt the specific gravity of the story settle into him. The weight of it, the way it accounted for things about this woman that her competence and her steadiness alone could not have explained. He had also felt something else, something that surfaced quietly below the level of conversation, below the level of his full consciousness in that moment, because the fever was already making its approach and his mind had not been fully reliable. But it surfaced, that something rising slowly through everything else, and it arrived with the quality of significance, the sense of a thing that matters, even if he couldn't yet say precisely what it was or why. South Halsted Street, November of 1983, a motorcycle club on the south side of Chicago. He knew something about that night. Not from his own experience, he had been 9 years old in 1983, living in a house in Lubbock, Texas, with no knowledge of or connection to what was happening in the alleys of Chicago's South Side. But from the accumulated oral history of the club, from the stories that got told at certain hours at certain gatherings, the stories a club tells about itself when it is being honest about the things it has done and the things that were done around it, which is less often than most members would prefer, but more often than outsiders would expect. He was not certain enough to say anything. The fever had been coming on, and his certainty about most things had been unreliable, and he had filed it in the same holding space. He had filed his suspicion about the leak in his chapter in the place reserved for things that required more information before they could become conclusions. On the afternoon of the third day, propped against the wall with a bowl of broth that Eleanor had produced and positioned in his hands with the quiet authority of a woman who is not making a suggestion, he looked at her and said, "How did you know his name?" Eleanor was changing his dressing. She did not look up. "Whose name?" she said. "Maddox," Rourke said. "You said his full name, his given name. You knew his birth date and his birthplace." Eleanor finished securing the dressing, stripped off her gloves, moved to the sink, and washed her hands. Elbows to fingertips, nothing left to chance. "After you were brought in," she said, her back to him, the water running, "I had time while Father Declan was gathering supplies. I know how to use a computer, Mr. Calhoun. I know how to conduct a search." Rourke said nothing. "There are public records," Eleanor said, turning off the water and reaching for the towel. "Federal court filings. For a man with Mr. Maddox's history, there is quite a lot of publicly available information if you know what you are looking for." She turned around. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. And what passed between them in that look was not an accusation and was not an admission, but was the acknowledgement, shared and mutual, that there was more present in this room than what was being said aloud. "You knew him before that," Rourke said. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up his empty broth bowl and moved toward the door. "Rest," she said. "You have at least a week before that wound will tolerate a motorcycle." She left the room. Rourke stared at the ceiling. The antibiotic drip moved through its quiet rhythm. Outside, through the thick adobe walls, he could hear Father Declan moving through the church, the particular quiet percussion of an elderly man maintaining a sacred space, the soft close of a door, the distant sound of a hymn being carried under someone's breath. He reached under the edge of the steel table where he had placed his burner phone during a moment of Eleanor's absence on the second day, slipping it under the table's lip with the deliberateness of a man who takes precautions as a matter of course. His fingers found it. He pulled it out and looked at it. Battery at 11%. He did not call Grizzly. Not yet. He opened the message function and typed 7 words to a number stored under no name in the contacts and sent it. Then he put the phone back under the table and closed his eyes. He was still there, eyes closed, when he heard the gate. Not the sound of it opening, the sound of footsteps outside it. One person, moving with a controlled deliberateness that was entirely different from the confident weight of Maddox's men 2 days ago. These were the footsteps of someone who was uncertain about something important and was moving toward the uncertainty because something had shifted in them that made staying put impossible. The footsteps stopped outside the gate. Rourke opened his eyes and looked at the high window. Through it, he could see a sliver of the courtyard, enough to tell him the light had shifted to the warm amber of a Texas afternoon, beginning its retreat toward evening. He lay still and listened. The gate opened. He heard Eleanor's voice from the courtyard, calm and without alarm. "This is private property." A younger voice, male, uncertain. "I know, I'm not here to, A pause that contained several things he couldn't make out. "I don't know why I'm here." The kind of silence Eleanor produced when she was listening rather than simply waiting. "You were with them," Eleanor said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. "You're hurt," Eleanor said. "It's nothing." "Come inside," Eleanor said. "I'll be the judge of what's nothing." Rourke listened to the footsteps cross the courtyard tiles. The oak door open and close, the two voices moving down the corridor and past the pantry door and continuing to the smaller room beyond. He lay there building from those fragments what picture he could. The young man's voice was not the voice of someone who had come to finish something. It was the voice of someone who was frightened by a decision he had made and did not yet know if the decision was right. Rourke recognized that voice. He had heard it at 19 coming out of his own throat in a moment that had required him to choose between two things without any clear signal about which choice led where. He heard Eleanor ask a question. He heard the young man's voice break slightly and recover. He heard Eleanor say something else lower that he couldn't make out. Then he heard her say clearly enough that the words came intact through the wall between them. How many and when? The answer came too quietly for him to catch. But Eleanor's silence after it was not the usual kind. This one had weight in it. This one pressed against the adobe between them. Rourke found the burner phone under the table. 4% battery. He opened the message function and typed 11 words to the same unstored number. He hit send, watched the screen confirm delivery, and the battery died and the screen went dark. He set the phone on the table and looked at the ceiling and waited. Eleanor came in 20 minutes later. She washed her hands. She checked the IV line. She checked the dressing. She performed each step of her assessment with the same thorough attention she always brought to it, and Rourke watched her and said nothing and waited for her to sit down. She pulled the chair close to the table and sat. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived in her courtyard, something had changed in the quality of what her eyes were doing. She was not frightened. Eleanor Byrne, he had concluded, was not someone who frightened easily, or perhaps at all. But something had changed in the quality of her steadiness. The steadiness was still there, fully intact, but it was being held now rather than simply existing. And the difference between those two things was visible to someone who had been watching her carefully for 3 days. The young man who just left, she said. I heard him, Rourke said. His name is not something you need, Eleanor said. He is 19 years old. He made some choices at 16 that narrowed his options considerably, and he has been working within those narrowed options ever since. That is the relevant context. Rourke waited. Maddox is coming back, Eleanor said. Tonight. She paused. He's not coming for you this time. Rourke was already pushing himself upright. Don't, Eleanor said, and the word arrived with enough force that he stopped. You will open the wound. Then tell me what he told you. Eleanor looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked back at him. Maddox knows this parish, she said. He has known it for some time. He is not here because you came through my gate, Mr. Calhoun. You coming through my gate was incidental. He was already planning to come here. She stopped. I am not a coincidence in this situation. I was the destination. The room held that sentence. The boy told you this, Rourke said. The boy told me what he knows, Eleanor said, which is that Maddox intends to burn the church tonight, with or without you inside it. Rourke looked at her, and the full shape of it was assembling itself now, and the shape was not what he had believed it was when he had stumbled through that gate 2.5 days ago. He had known at some level, from the moment he watched Maddox stand at the gate and look at the cross with that expression he couldn't name, he had known that the simplest explanation was not the correct one. The simplest explanation was that Maddox had followed a wounded angel to a church, found a stubborn nun in the way, and eventually recalculated the risk. Clean, understandable. The end of the story. But the pauses had been there. The way Eleanor had said, I know what he is. The way Maddox had stood at the gate before riding away. The way she had found his full name and his birth records in the time it took Father Declan to gather supplies, which was either the action of a very resourceful woman or the action of a woman who had already known precisely where to look. Eleanor, Rourke said. She looked at him. How long have you known who he was? The silence that followed was different from any that had come before it. Not the silence of a woman deciding what to say. The silence of a woman who has been waiting for a specific question and is now deciding whether this is the moment for the answer she has been carrying. She looked down at the rosary in her hands, which he had not noticed her pick up the beads, dark and smooth from decades of use. Patrick died in November of 1983, she said. You told me, Rourke said. What I didn't tell you, Eleanor said, is that it took me 2 years to learn who had ordered it. She paused. It took me another 38 years to learn where he was. The words settled into the room and stayed there. He came here, Rourke said slowly, not because I came through your gate. He came here because he found out where you were. Yes, Eleanor said. He's been here before, Rourke said, remembering the image he had been carrying since the first day. The way he stood at the gate before he left. He knew the cross. Eleanor nodded once. Her hands were still in her lap, the rosary moving slowly between her fingers. He came 6 months ago, she said. Alone. A different bike. He stood at the gate for about 2 minutes. I watched from the window. A pause. I recognized him immediately. He didn't come in, Rourke said. No, Eleanor said. He didn't. Rourke looked at her steadily. He's not coming tonight to finish what he started with me. No, Eleanor said. He's coming to eliminate the last witness. Eleanor met his eyes. That is what I believe, yes. Rourke reached under the table. His hand found the dead phone. He looked at it for a moment, then set it on the table. I sent a message to my president 2 hours ago, he said. The battery is gone. I don't know if it went through. Eleanor absorbed this. She looked at the dead phone. Then she stood and moved to the shelving and reached behind the second row of canned goods and brought out a small black flip phone that looked as though it had been manufactured sometime in the first decade of the previous century, and she held it out to him. Father Declan keeps this for emergencies, she said. In 22 years, he has never used it. Rourke took the phone and opened it. It had a charge. He looked at Eleanor. Make your call, she said. She moved toward the door. Tell them to come quietly. I don't want engines on this road before we're ready for them. She paused in the doorway, her back to him, one hand on the frame. Tell your president the whole story, Mr. Calhoun, she said. Not just the part about you. She left the room and he sat in the silence of the pantry with the old phone in his hand, and the IV line in his arm, and the smell of iodine and stored goods around him. And he thought about Patrick Byrne dying alone in a Chicago alley in the November of a year when Rourke had been 9 years old and living in Lubbock. And he thought about a woman spending 40 years finding out where the man responsible had gone. And then 17 more years tending roses and stitching wounds in a parish at the edge of the Texas scrubland, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has decided what they believe and has built their life accordingly. He thought about the way Eleanor had not gone inside when she should have. He dialed Grizzly Boone's number from memory, and it rang twice, and when the voice came through, it was not the voice of a man who had been sleeping. Rourke, Grizzly said. I'm alive, Rourke said. I need you to listen to everything I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to bring everybody. Grizzly Boone listened without interrupting. That was not his natural way. Arthur Boone had spent 30 years building and defending, and on a few necessary occasions, dismantling things, and he had done all of it with the forward momentum of a man for whom patience was a tactical selection rather than a temperamental one. He interrupted people. He reached conclusions before they finished presenting the evidence. He made decisions in the middle of other people's thinking and moved on before they had caught up to where he already was. It was one of the qualities that had made him effective, and one of the qualities that had cost him things he might have preferred to keep. But he listened to Rourke Calhoun without a word from the first sentence to the last. When Rourke finished, the line held silence long enough that Rourke checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. Say the name again, Grizzly said. Clayton Ray Maddox, Rourke said. Born 1959, Odessa. A shorter silence this time, but more concentrated, the silence of a man in whom something has been activated. I'm going to make a call, Grizzly said. While I'm making it, you call me back on this number in 20 minutes. Can you hold 20 minutes? I can hold, Rourke said. The line went dead. Rourke set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Through the walls, he could hear Eleanor moving through the darkening church, the soft, deliberate sounds of a woman going through a space she knew completely without needing light for it. He heard a door. He heard faintly the low, continuous sound of her voice in prayer, not addressed to him, addressed to the presence she had been in conversation with for 40 years. He lay there and thought about what he had said to Grizzly, and what Grizzly had not said in return, and he thought about the quality of that silence when the name was spoken, and he thought about the 11 years he had known Arthur Boone, and the specific texture of the man's different silences, and what each of them meant. That one had recognized something. 22 minutes later, Rourke called back. Grizzly answered before the first ring had finished. "Chicago," Grizzly said. "Southside, 1983. "Yes," Rourke said. "I reached a man who was riding in Illinois in those years." Grizzly's voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate the way a man speaks when he has become aware that the words he is choosing cannot be taken back once they have been said. There was an incident. November of '83, a man named Byrne, Patrick Byrne. He wasn't affiliated with us, but he ran an adjacent territory. He was found in an alley off South Halsted. Single stab wound. Nobody was charged. Rourke said nothing. "My contact remembers who gave the order," Grizzly said. "He remembers because the man who gave it was not discreet about it afterward. He considered it a message and wanted it understood as one." A pause. "The name he gave me was Maddox." The old phone was light in Rourke's hand. He was aware of the weight of the building around him, the thick adobe walls, the wooden cross above the door he couldn't see from here, but could feel the presence of in the way certain things make themselves felt, without requiring line of sight. "She knew," Rourke said. "What?" "Sister Eleanor. She already knew. She has known for years, Grizzly. And Maddox found out where she was. He came here 6 months ago and stood at her gate and looked in. He's coming tonight to make sure she can't testify to anything in any forum ever." The silence on the line had Grizzly thinking in it now, the specific quality of a man running variables with the focused efficiency that had kept him in the chapter president's chair for 16 consecutive years. "How long do we have?" Grizzly said. "Tonight, no time given." "How many men?" 15 was the number I caught through the wall." "Right," Grizzly said, and then with the flat, settled quality that meant he had arrived at a decision, "We're coming, all of us. One thing first." "What?" "The nun," Grizzly said. "She know you called me." "She told me to call you," Rourke said. "She told me to tell you the whole story." A pause. "She sounds like someone I need to meet," Grizzly said. "Come quietly," Rourke said. "She asked for that specifically." Rourke. "Yeah. You stay on that table until we get there. That's not a suggestion." Rourke looked at the dressing on his side. He thought about the grinding, specific pain that accompanied any movement more significant than shifting his weight, and he thought about 3 days of antibiotics and broth, and Eleanor's hands, and Father Declan's coffee, and he thought about what all of that had cost both of them. "I'll do what I can," he said. He heard something that might have been a sound of dissatisfaction, and then the line went quiet. He set the phone down and closed his eyes and ran the inventory again. The inventory he had been running for 3 days. Fingers, toes, the ability to draw breath. The wound was closed and the infection was receding, but the tissue remained raw, and the rib still ground against itself when he moved in certain ways. And getting off the table and standing upright was a project requiring planning and execution rather than simply the decision to attempt it. He began planning. Eleanor came in an hour later carrying bread and soup, and she stopped when she found him sitting upright on the edge of the table, feet on the floor, the IV line pulled to its full extension to accommodate the change in position. She looked at him. She looked at the phone on the table. "They're coming," Rourke said. She set the food on the shelf. "How long?" 3 hours, maybe less depending on where they were. Eleanor nodded and began moving through the room with the focused economy of motion that was her response to any situation requiring preparation, the immediate translation of understanding into action. She checked the medical bag. She counted the wound dressings. She replaced the IV bag with a fresh one from the refrigerated unit at the shelf's end. "Eat," she said, nodding at the bread and soup. "Eleanor," Rourke said. She didn't stop moving. "Grizzly confirmed it," Rourke said. "Maddox gave the order. 1983, confirmed." Eleanor went still. She was facing the shelf, her hands resting on a box of wound dressings, and she held that stillness for a long moment, in the way she held all difficult things with the interior version of the same calm assessment she performed externally. Then she picked up the wound dressings and placed them in the medical bag. "I know," she said. "You've known for a long time," Rourke said. "Yes." "And you stayed here," Rourke said. "In this church, in this courtyard, knowing." "I have been a member of my order for 40 years, Mr. Calhoun," Eleanor said. "I made a choice about how to spend the time I was given, and I have spent it accordingly." "And Maddox," Rourke said. "Maddox spent his time differently." She closed the medical bag and turned around and looked at him with those pale eyes that were carrying more in them at this hour than they usually permitted to show. "That is between him and God. It has always been between him and God. I have never believed it was between him and me." Rourke stared at her. "He ordered your brother killed." "Yes." "And you're telling me that's between him and God?" "I'm telling you what I believe," Eleanor said. "I am not telling you what I feel. Those are not always the same thing, Mr. Calhoun. Anyone who has lived long enough knows that." She moved to the chair and sat down and folded her hands in her lap, and Rourke looked at her and thought about 40 years of living in the distance between what you believe and what you feel, about making that distance into a vocation, about building something in that distance that fed people and housed people and stitched wounds and kept its gate unlocked at night. He ate the bread. He drank the soup. They waited. Father Declan joined them at 9 in the evening with 2 cups of coffee and his expression of untroubled faith completely intact, and he handed the cups to Eleanor and Rourke and withdrew to his position in the doorway and folded his hands and waited with them in the quality of patience that 80 years of practice produces. At 10:17, Rourke heard engines, not motorcycles. The sound of trucks moving slowly on the road with their engines deliberately reduced the sound of people approaching a place with care and intention. He was already getting off the table when Eleanor put her hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. She went to the high window and stood beneath it, listening, and then something along the line of her shoulders released by a degree, and she turned back. "Trucks," she said. "Pickup trucks." Rourke understood. They left the bikes behind. Eleanor looked at him. "Your people came quietly," she said. There was something in her voice when she said it. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to the recognition of a thing she had been told and had chosen to believe and was now discovering had been true. Rourke got off the table. It cost him what it always cost him now. The grinding protest of the wound, the leg that didn't want to carry full weight with the confidence he expected of it. He stood. He put one hand on the table's edge and waited for the vertigo to pass, and then let go and stood on his own. And Eleanor watched him do this without moving to help him, because she understood in the way that people who have spent long years with damaged bodies understand that there are moments when the help is the obstacle. He took 3 steps toward the door. "Mr. Calhoun," Eleanor said. He stopped. "You are not healed," she said. "You are upright. Those are not the same thing." "I know the difference," he said. "Then know this as well," she said. "Whatever happens tonight, it ends here. Not on that road, not somewhere else. Here." She held his gaze. "This is still my church." "Yes, ma'am," Rourke said. He went to the door. The courtyard was dark. The wrought iron gate was closed. Beyond it, on the road's gravel shoulder, 4 pickup trucks sat with their headlights off in the attitude of vehicles that had been placed with intention rather than simply parked. Figures moved around them in the darkness, quiet and unhurried, and Rourke stood in the rectory doorway and watched them and felt something he had not expected, which was not relief exactly, but was in the same vicinity of it. The settling that occurs when a person realizes they are not alone in the thing they are facing. Arthur Boone came through the gate. He was a large man, Grizzly Boone bald and heavily tattooed, and carrying in his bearing the accumulated gravity of everything he had done and decided and survived across a life lived without apology on its terms. And he moved through the gate with the quiet authority of a man who has taken the request for silence seriously and has honored it completely. No engines, no theater. Oh, just men coming through a gate in the dark and positioning themselves along the perimeter wall with the organized efficiency of people who have discussed what they are doing and why. He stopped in front of Rourke. He looked at him, at the dressing visible at the collar of the borrowed shirt, at the way Rourke was standing, the slight compensation in his posture, the hand resting against the doorframe in a way that was almost casual but not quite. "You look terrible," Grizzly said. "Thank you for coming," Rourke said. Grizzly looked past him into the rectory, and Rourke turned and saw Eleanor standing in the corridor behind him, her hands folded, her veil straight, her expression carrying the same steady reckoning she had brought to every situation that had arrived at her door since Rourke had fallen through the gate 3 days ago. Grizzly looked at her for a long moment. Then he removed his sunglasses, which he wore regardless of the hour, and held them in his hand. "Sister," he said. "Mr. Boone," Eleanor said. "I was told to tell you the whole story," Grizzly said. "I want you to know I received it." Eleanor held his gaze. "Then you understand why they're coming." "I understand," Grizzly said. "And I want you to know that what was done to your brother and who did it has not gone unregistered. Not by me. Not tonight." Eleanor studied him for a moment with the full, unrushed attention she gave to things requiring complete consideration. "I appreciate that," she said. "I want you to know something in return, Mr. Boone. Nobody dies on my property tonight. That is not a request." Grizzly held her gaze. He was not a man who was frequently told things in that tone by anyone, and the experience of being told them by a 70-year-old woman in a religious habit appeared to be something he was genuinely processing. "Nobody dies," he said. "You have my word." Eleanor nodded once. "Then let's be ready." They came at 11:40, not from the south where the road ran straight and open and visible for miles. They came from the north, which meant farm roads and advance reconnaissance, which meant the boy who had warned Eleanor had been right about the planning, even if not every detail. They came without headlights and on motorcycles, after all, not the full thunder of their first visit, but something quieter and more deliberate engines idled low. The sound of them not arriving so much as accumulating gradually at the edges of the night like weather building. Rourke was standing in the doorway of the rectory. Eleanor was in the courtyard. She had come out 20 minutes before Maddox's men appeared and had stood in the center of the courtyard in the dark with her rosary in her hands and her back straight and her face toward the gate. When Rourke had moved to stand beside her, she had looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely without negotiating room. "Behind me," she said. "Eleanor." "Behind me," she said again. "You can barely stand Mr. Calhoun, and this is not your conversation." He had gone to the rectory doorway. He stood there now with Father Declan behind him, and the knowledge of Grizzly's men positioned along the walls in the dark, and he watched the gate. Maddox came through first. He was alone for 3 steps, and then his men followed, and Rourke counted them in the dark, 9, 10, 11, 14, when the count stopped. 14 men spreading across the courtyard with the practiced movement of people executing a rehearsed plan, and several of them were carrying things that caught the faint ambient light in ways that meant what they meant, and the smell of accelerant reached Rourke on the night air a moment after the men did. Maddox stopped. Eleanor was 10 feet in front of him. She had not moved. The tableau held for a long moment in the dark, the large man and the small woman, and the space between them charged with 40 years of history that only 2 of the people present fully understood. Rourke thought about the first time this had happened in the full sun 2 days ago, and about what he understood now about what Maddox's expression had meant when he stood at the gate and looked at the cross. "Sister," Maddox said. His voice had changed from what it had been that first afternoon, quieter, stripped of its theatrical quality. "I was hoping you'd be inside." "I know you were," Eleanor said. Maddox looked at her. His men had spread out and stopped waiting, and the ones carrying the accelerant had stopped with them. And the courtyard was very quiet, except for the insects and the faint movement of a warm wind through the scrubland beyond the road. "This doesn't have to be what it looks like," Maddox said. "It looks like what it is," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the church behind her, at the cross above the door, and his expression in the dark was not the expression of a man executing a plan without complication. It was the expression of a man who has been traveling toward a particular place for a long time and has arrived to find that the place is different from what he carried in his mind. "You know why I'm here," he said. "I know why you think you're here," Eleanor said. "You think you're here to close a door that has been open for 40 years. You think I am a liability. You think that what I know about Patrick and about South Halsted Street in November of 1983 represents a risk to you that has grown unacceptable." Maddox said nothing. "Clayton," Eleanor said. He went still. She had not used that name before. Not Mr. Maddox, not Bull, not the full formal name from public records. Just the name itself, bare and direct, the name given before everything else was built on top of it. "Clayton Ray Maddox," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than it had been all evening. "You were born in March of 1959 in Odessa, Texas. You were 24 years old in November of 1983. My brother Patrick was 33 years old. He had been writing for 6 years. He had never in 6 years done anything that warranted what you ordered." Maddox's jaw was set hard. "I have known who you were for 38 years, Eleanor said. "I have known where you were for the last 2. I have sat in this courtyard for 17 years, and I have thought about you and Patrick and that alley a great many times. I want you to hear what I decided." The courtyard was completely silent. "I decided that I would not carry hatred for you," Eleanor said. "Not because you deserve to be free of it, but because I did not intend to spend the rest of my life in a cage of my own construction." She paused. "I forgive you, Clayton. I have forgiven you for a long time. And I understand that that may be the most difficult thing I could say to you, because a woman who hates you is a woman you understand. A woman who forgives you is something you have no category for." Maddox was looking at her, and his face in the dark was doing something complicated and involuntary. The way faces do when something reaches past the defenses a person has spent years building and contacts the structure underneath. "You came here to eliminate a witness," Eleanor said. "But I want you to understand something clearly. I am not your only witness. What I know, others now know. Burning this church closes nothing. It eliminates nothing." She looked at him steadily. "You came all this way, Clayton, and the door is still open. It will always be open. The only question is what you choose to do with that." Maddox opened his mouth and closed it. And then the perimeter wall moved. Not literally, but the darkness along the top of it shifted, and in the shifting shapes became visible the shapes of men with their forearms resting on the top edge. And from the darkness to the left of the gate came the soft compression of weight on gravel, and from the right the same. And Clayton Maddox turned his head left and then right and performed the same count Rourke had performed when Maddox's men came through the gate. 31 men. Not along one wall. Along all 3 visible walls of the courtyard, positioned with the quiet discipline of people who had been there for longer than anyone had noticed, who had come through back ways and sideways and gaps in the dark, without sound or light, who had arrived before Maddox's men had finished positioning themselves and had simply waited. Arthur Boone came through the gate. He walked through it and stopped and looked at Clayton Maddox with the flat, settled attention of a man who has already made his decision and is simply present for what follows from it. "Maddox," Grizzly said. Maddox looked at him. He looked at the walls. He looked at his 14 men who were looking at 31 and performing the arithmetic that any person performs when the numbers are that clear. "We got a call," Grizzly said. "About a church, about a nun." He paused. "About Chicago, 1983. His voice carried no heat. Just the statement of facts in the order they had arrived. "My brother rode through your gate 2 days ago. That's between us, and we'll have that conversation somewhere else some other time. But the rest of it." He held Maddox's eyes with a steadiness that was in its own way as absolute as Eleanor's. The rest of it doesn't have a conversation. You're done here. Maddox looked at his men. He looked at the walls. He looked at Eleanor, who was standing exactly where she had been standing, who had not moved, who was watching him with the same clear, unwavering attention she had brought to everything since the moment Rourke had fallen through her gate. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the crowbar in his hand as though he had forgotten it was there. He let it hang loose at his side. He looked back at Eleanor. "You should have run," he said. "When I came in the spring, when you saw me at the gate, you should have left." "I don't run from my church," Eleanor said. Something moved through Maddox's expression at that. Something that came from a depth the calculating part of him didn't have access to. Then he nodded once, a small motion that was not agreement, but was in the register of acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of something he had perhaps known for some time and had been trying to outrun, and he turned and walked through the gate, and his men went with him, and the engine started somewhere on the road. And the sound of them moved south and did not return. Grizzly stood in the gate and watched until the last of it was gone. Then he turned and walked into the center of the courtyard and stopped in front of Eleanor Byrne. He looked at her, this large, bald, heavily marked man carrying 30 years of everything he had done and survived, and the expression on his face was not the expression he wore when managing situations. He went to one knee. The terracotta was hard and the posture was not a comfortable one for a man of his build and age, but he held it with complete steadiness, and the men along the walls held still, and Father Declan in the doorway held still, and Rourke held still. "Sister Byrne," Grizzly said, "what was done to your brother and what was almost done here tonight I can't undo. I know that. But I can tell you that this place will not be threatened again. Not by Maddox, not by anyone who understands what I mean when I give my word." He paused. "From tonight, St. Jude's is protected ground. Any man who brings violence within a mile of this gate answers to me personally." Eleanor looked down at him. Her expression was composed and direct, and carried in it the quality of a woman who has received words with full attention and is deciding what weight they merit. "Stand up, Mr. Boone," she said. "You'll ruin your denim." Something moved through the men along the walls. Not quite laughter. Something in that neighborhood, the release of breath held for a long time the shift in a room's atmosphere, when something that has been wound tightly is finally permitted to ease. Grizzly stood. He reached inside his cut and produced a thick envelope and held it out to Eleanor. "The parish has been managing a difficult financial situation," Grizzly said. "We did our research. There is $50,000 in that envelope. Clean money offered without conditions and without any expectation of anything in return. Fix the roof. Keep the clinic running. Buy rose bushes." Eleanor looked at the envelope. She looked at Grizzly's face. She looked at Rourke in the doorway, who was standing with his hand on the frame and his face carrying the expression of a man who is experiencing several things simultaneously and has not yet sorted them into any order. "The clinic serves people who have nowhere else to go," Eleanor said. She took the envelope. "I will use it accordingly." She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then looked up at the Texas sky, very dark and very large, and filled with the kind of stars that are only visible when you are far enough from any light to see what was always there. Rourke came across the courtyard. He moved carefully, still managing the wound, still compensating in his posture, and he stopped beside Grizzly, and they stood there together in front of Eleanor, the three of them, the nun and the chapter president, and the man who had come through the gate 3 days ago and changed everything by doing so. Grizzly looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back at him. Nothing passed between them that needed to be said aloud. They had been brothers long enough to understand when words were unnecessary, when what needed communicating had already been communicated by the fact of being present, by the fact of coming when called, by all the accumulated evidence of shared history that makes language redundant. "We'll be back to fix the roof," Grizzly said to Eleanor, "before the rains come." Eleanor was already turning back toward her roses. "I'll have coffee ready," she said without turning around. Grizzly walked to the gate. His men came down from the walls and followed him through it quietly, in the same unhurried order in which they had arrived, and the trucks on the road started up one by one, and their headlights came on, and they moved off north on FM 462. Rourke stood at the gate for a moment after the last truck had gone, and the road was quiet again. Then he turned and looked back through the wrought iron at the courtyard, at the church, at the wooden cross above the door just visible in the starlight, at the small figure of Eleanor Byrne moving along the wall of roses with her hands working at the stems in the dark, not needing light for it, knowing exactly where everything was and what it needed. He had come through that gate 3 days ago expecting to die on the tiles. He had come through it on his knees, bleeding from a wound he couldn't close, running from something that hadn't finished with him, and he had found on the other side of it a woman who had spent 40 years building something in the distance between grief and faith, something practical and alive and deliberately open to whoever showed up at the gate needing it. A clinic stocked by someone who knew exactly what to stock it with. A garden planted in ground that didn't want to grow things, by someone who understood that the things worth tending are the ones that require the most persistence. A gate that was never locked because Eleanor Byrne had long ago decided that the people who needed it most came after dark. He had watched her stand in front of Clayton Maddox twice and say the things that needed saying without retreating, without performing the absence of fear, because she did not need to perform it without raising her voice or her hands, or anything except the full settled weight of a life lived with conviction. He had heard her say, "I forgive you," to the man who had ordered her brother killed, and he had understood, standing in that courtyard in the dark, with the smell of accelerant still on the air, that what he was hearing was not weakness and was not resignation. It was the most difficult and costly kind of strength, the strength of a person who has looked clearly at what the alternative costs, who has decided the price is too high, who has chosen something harder than hatred and has maintained that choice across 40 years of a life that would have given her every justification to abandon it. He stood at the gate for a long moment in the quiet. He thought about the patch on his back and the 15 years it represented, and the life he had built inside those years, the brotherhood of it, the clarity of it, the way it had given him a structure and a set of obligations that had felt for most of those years like the truest things he had. He thought about the word brother, the way he had said it during the fever with that weight, and about what it meant to Grizzly and what it meant to the 30 men who had come through a gate in the dark without engines and without theater because one of their own had needed them to. He thought about Eleanor saying Patrick would have liked you, and about the specific quality of grief. Those words had carried the grief of a woman who has held someone in her memory for 40 years with such care and completeness that she can still make specific predictions about how they would have responded to a person they never got the chance to meet. He thought about the 9-year-old boy in Lubbock, Texas, who had been completely unaware in November of 1983 that anything of consequence was happening in a Chicago alley. About the distance between that boy and the man standing at this gate, and about all the things that had happened in between, and about which of those things he was certain of and which he was not. Something had shifted in the last 3 days. He couldn't name it precisely, and he didn't try to. It was not a conversion, and it was not a revelation. It was something quieter than either of those things, a question that had not been present before, and was present now, a question about what it meant to choose something and what it meant to maintain that choice when the maintaining became difficult. A question Eleanor Byrne had been answering with her life for 40 years and had never once required anyone to acknowledge. He turned away from the courtyard and walked to the truck Grizzly was holding the door of, and the door closed behind him, and the truck moved north on FM 462. And through the window, Rourke watched the lights of St. Jude Parish recede, until the road curved and the church disappeared behind the flat, dark line of the Texas horizon. In the courtyard, Sister Eleanor Byrne finished with the roses and went inside. She moved through this darkened church with the ease of a woman who has no need of light in a place she has inhabited for 17 years, every threshold and corridor and turn of it as familiar as her own hands. She put the kettle on beside Father Declan's, because that was what you did at the end of a long day, and she washed her hands at the deep industrial sink with the thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered. And she stood for a moment in the pantry where 3 days ago she had put a stranger on a steel table and made the decision, the same decision she made every time it presented itself, not to walk past. She took the envelope from her apron pocket and set it on the shelf between the IV bags and the wound dressings and the broad-spectrum antibiotics, and she looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she went to her room. She took her rosary from the table beside her bed and sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the courtyard, in the gate, and the dark road beyond. She began moving through the beads in the dark, the weight of them familiar in her hands, the rhythm of it as natural as breathing. The same conversation she had been having for 40 years with the same patient, inexhaustible presence. She said Patrick's name. She said it the way she always said it in the late hours, not with the sharp edge that grief has when it is still new, but with the plain, steady quality of someone speaking the name of a person who is real to them, who remains real to them, who will always be real to them, regardless of what time does or does not do to the distance. She said it the way you say the name of someone you are still in conversation with even now, even across all the years and all the distance and all the silence that passes between one kind of existence and another. She sat for a long time. Outside the window, the Texas night was very quiet. The roses moved slightly in a warm wind coming from the south across the scrubland, the same wind that had been moving across this land for longer than anyone could account for passing through and continuing the way wind does. The stars were enormous and indifferent and very beautiful, the way they always were out here, where there was nothing between you and them. The gate of St. Jude Parish stood open. It stood open the way it always stood open, unlatched, swinging very slightly in the warm wind, casting a long, thin shadow across the terracotta tiles of the courtyard, where the blood had dried and been cleaned, and was now just tiles again. Just the ordinary terracotta of an ordinary courtyard, belonging to a small parish at the edge of the Texas scrubland, tended by a woman who had been here for 17 years and intended to be here for whatever years remained doing what she had always done. She had never locked the gate at night. She had always believed, and had found no reason across 17 years to revise the belief that the people who needed what was behind it most were the ones who arrived after dark. The ones the daylight hours had not been sufficient to help the ones who came stumbling through with their hands pressed to their wounds and their boots scraping across the gravel and their faces turned toward whatever light was still on. She believed it because Patrick had needed it once, and there had been no gate open for him. She would not be the reason there was no gate open for someone else. She moved through the final decade of the rosary in the dark, and the warm wind continued through the courtyard, and the roses moved in it persistent and alive, blooming in ground that did not make blooming easy, which was Eleanor Byrne had always thought precisely the point.